almost mission impossible.
You tell your suppliers to source other sources of things. Where are they going to go? To the moon?
Close to 75% of bill of material value in a Tesla vehicle is dependent on something to do with Chinese production.
I think Tesla will decline greatly in the United States.
Talk is cheap, but real action in supply chain reconfiguration is expensive and difficult.
Maybe we're likely to see sort of a two-track system when it comes to automobile or generally mobility developments.
The Chat Lounge. Chat Lounge.
Chat Lounge.
The Chat Lounge unpacks views and opinions on hot issues in a more casual way.
Welcome to the Chat Lounge. I'm Tuyun. Tesla is accelerating its shift away from components made in China. The U.S. automaker is reportedly requiring its suppliers to eliminate China-made auto parts for cars built in the United States within the next year or two. So join me for a chat on this topic. Liang, professor of economics, Willamette University, the United States. Warwick Powell, adjunct professor, Queensland University of Technology, Australia. And Joseph Siracusa, professor of global futures, Curtin University, also Australia. A warm welcome to you all, professors. So first things first, a gut question for you all. Is Tesla's mission possible? Yes or no? Joseph, can we begin with you?
I think it's impossible to decouple the Chinese economy, which is one of the biggest in the world, with the United States, which is the second biggest in the world. No, that's not possible.
Okay, thanks. And Warwick?
No.
All right, we got two no's. And Yan, what's your view?
If I have to say in one word, no. If I could have two words, I would say highly unlikely.
Okay, thanks for that. And we'll have a more elaboration on that later on. But let's turn to the timing. Tesla has actually long relied on China's supply chain. Yet, why is it suddenly demanding suppliers remove all China-made components within 2 years?
Well, I think this is not the first time, right? I think during Biden's time, to be eligible to the government subsidies, right, the $7,500 of buyer subsidies from the federal government, and then there are some state subsidies. Tesla already started to do that, to the so-called de-Sinicization, right? That they wanted to reduce the reliance on China's components to be eligible, because the criteria is that the EVs need to have less than 50% of their parts and components that are, sourced from China. So I think from there, Tesla already started to try to, localize so-called the sources. And then now I think the geopolitical, I think some sort of tensions, the potential of tariff, and also the sort of so-called weaponization of supply chain by China. I think those are probably the reasons for why Tesla is doing it. But at the same time, I think a lot of times this could be also just a gesture to tell the first tier suppliers that they should cut the China parts out of the supply chain. But for the tier 2, tier 3, and even lower tiers of suppliers, I think there's really very, very unlikely that they're going to really turn against, China's supply chain, especially for a lot of these battery minerals and so on and so forth. China really has the complete dominance. For example, the graphite, when it comes to the batteries quality graphite, China accounts for 93% of the processing capacity, and also some of the rare earths that would find their way to the EVs. Again, China has the monopoly kind of processing capacity in those areas. So it's very highly unlikely, at least in that time period. We're talking about 1 or 2 years. That is almost mission impossible.
Okay, you've almost answered them all. Right, to Joseph maybe. So Yan just mentioned that there is external geopolitical pressure there. So to what extent is actually Tesla acting in anticipation of potentially more aggressive U.S. trade policies under a Trump administration after the 2026 midterms? Is there informal pressure from the U.S. government or Congress, to your knowledge?
I think all these decisions are politically based. I regard Tesla's attempt to restrict Chinese supply chain here, that is component parts, in this automobile, as sort of a grotesque genuflection to the Trump administration to say that, look, we're doing our bit. I mean, it's not going to work. General Motors is trying this. It's not going to work. I'm old enough to remember when every television in the United States, every television in the United States is made in the United States. And by 1970, no television was made in the United States for a reason. It is because of the global economy and the various ability and skills of other nations to contribute to a global economy. The trouble with all this is this anti-globalization has created this mindlessness in Washington. And I mean, people in high places don't have a clue about what they're doing. And I've been arguing in my whole life. I have a long career in academic life, 53 years. And I've been arguing against sanctions and tariffs because they breed ill will, they poison foreign economic policy and diplomacy, and they have this kind of nonsense endings. I understand that Tesla would be happy if China took a factory and went to Mexico, so it's not sourced from China anymore, but from Mexico or maybe Canada. You see, now we're talking nonsense. But I think this is a personal decision by Elon Musk to push this. And, he's not a great political thinker, but he is trying to sidle up to Donald Trump, who is kind of motivated or informed by a very primitive economic nationalism. It doesn't work very well, but, it plays to his base. And of course, today, Elon Musk is back in the White House. He's part of a party with the leader of Saudi Arabia. He's back in the Trump fold. So this is the kind of thing he does to sort of burnish his bona fides when he wants to sit down at the table with Trump and his MAGA secretaries.
You said it's a personal decision, but some people are saying maybe, given Tesla's declining sales, especially on the Chinese market, its market share has fallen to around 3% recently in October from nearly 9% in September. Then Warwick, is this decision or de-Sinicization also a way to shift blame for business challenges or manage investor expectations then?
Well, if I'm still I'm sorry, go ahead.
Look, both Yan and Joseph, I think, touched on some of the key macro dimensions, and you have also touched on the fact that Tesla itself is experiencing declining sales, not just in China, actually, but globally. It's under significant pressure in terms of its global footprint for various reasons, and is seeking, I think, to curry favour with the American administration with the hopes that it will be able to gain financial and other favour, which would assist Tesla to mitigate some of its sales volume declines and declining and revenue pressures elsewhere in the global market. If you looked at a Tesla motor vehicle and you broke down that vehicle in terms of the component parts and the component parts that make up the component parts and the raw materials that then feed into the subcomponent parts, you will actually find that close to 75% of bill of material value in a Tesla vehicle is dependent on something to do with Chinese production. There is no avoiding these realities. And I think the talk of reducing dependency is an administrative fig leaf, which is the politics of it. But in practical terms, it will seek to fudge the reality by perhaps having more things appear to be made in one jurisdiction when in fact most of the subcomponent parts come from elsewhere. This is a very, very difficult problem for Tesla. It had built a business model around Chinese supply chains and Chinese production ecosystems and know-how. It is now confronting global competitive pressures that I suspect 6-7 years ago it simply did not anticipate, and is now in a politically charged environment where it needs the political support of the American administration, whilst at the same time it needs to preserve what economic competitiveness it gets from having these supply chain linkages that it currently does. It's a terrible position to be in, frankly. And I'm not sure that its founder is necessarily the best placed person to navigate these difficulties.
But it has to make some move first, right, to diversify its sourcing places. Right?
Well, in theory, yes, if it wants to achieve this particular objective. Let's not forget that diversification in and of itself is not an economic or a business strategy.
Right.
It could be argued that diversification is risk mitigation. Having multiple supply sources enables you to cushion any ups and downs from different parts of the supply chain network. But so far, the talk of diversification is entirely political. And that means that from an economic and a business and a cost control point of view, there is every likelihood that diversification will either fail or lead to significant diseconomies, whether it's through poor integration, misaligned coordination between new upstream suppliers and downstream requirements. And in fact, it will come up against physical constraints in alternative upstream markets that simply have not been set up to cater for any new high volume demand growth. This is not an easy thing to change.
Right.
Maybe it's something in theory that you could accomplish in 7 to 10 years if everything goes right for you. But these supply chains emerged in an organic fashion over the course of the last 30 to 40 years, clicking your fingers because of the political flavour of the day in the hopes that somehow you can unwind 30 to 40 years of continual optimization, adaptation, and learning is simply not a realistic proposition.
Okay. Joseph, you were saying?
Well, I was going to say that I think Tesla, like General Motors, is trying to sort of reduce its dependency or its kind of the debt it owes to the Chinese supply chains. This has been going on since COVID, not just a political thing here. And I think they're trying to do certain things so that they could have control that they may not have control, because in an economy like this, an international economy, it's really hard to have control over everything. But they're trying to have some control, and they're trying to be able to turn it on and off. They're trying to have some resiliency without just thinking about the cheapest option. In other words, they're trying to do a whole bunch of things at once. And keep in mind, now I'm going to put on my stock market hat. Many years ago, I was a stockbroker for Merrill Lynch in New York. And I can tell you what both your guests already know, that the business economy in America abhors uncertainty and politics and that kind of thing. And so a lot of these companies are trying to play a game that they can't play. I mean, they've engaged in reducing dependency on the cheapest, best parts. I mean, if we blocked out politics for 10 minutes, we'd go back to where we were. But I don't think General Motors or even Musk can actually get absolute decision on this, because when you get down, as has been mentioned, the tier 2 and tier 3 suppliers, they're not going to be making this kind of move because it's going to cost them money. But you're right, they works right about this is an organic process that began a certain way, and it's sort of like taking a live animal apart and trying to make a better one. I mean, it doesn't work that way. And it is organic. And I think as soon as you introduce politics into the business plan, et cetera, you may have a lot of enthusiastic cheerleaders, particularly, the military-industrial complex in America. As soon as you mention the word China, you can start buying certain stocks in the United States because of the large commitment to the military-industrial community. The thing is, it just doesn't work that way. Americans like very much Chinese sneakers and computers and televisions, and if you started to put these kinds of components on these things, they're not going to pay twice as much for this. And I don't know what Tesla's problems are in China, except I don't think Elon Musk has spent much attention thinking about his Chinese market. He's been too much involved in American domestic politics, too much involved in the space race. I mean, I don't think he has his head in the same where it should be. So there might be very special conditions about what's going on there. But this idea of trying to compete economically and politically in the United States, it's a very difficult act to follow.
The Chat Lounge. The Chat Lounge unpacks views and opinions on hot issues in a more casual way.
You mentioned General Motors. Sometimes it's quite hard for those companies to resist some pressure especially from the government. But Yan, like Joseph mentioned, General Motors actually instructed its thousands of suppliers to eliminate all China-made parts by 2027. I'm not sure about other automakers like Ford, if it's also got the same plan. Does this suggest U.S. automakers are converging on a unified China-free supply chain strategy?
Well, I think we have to make the distinction. I think even for Tesla, right, that they talked about being more locally sourced. There are two caveats to that. One is that they literally basically telling some of their suppliers to move some of the productions or open up some, foreign shops in countries like Mexico, for instance, right? So essentially what they say is, we, again, because of this political pressure, we have to cut out these sort of made in China components. But it's not that, right? I mean, it's the Chinese makers that move part of the production to, let's say, Mexico. And so how do you define that as not Chinese components? And I think that there is some kind of question about that, right? Which is, I think it's a kind of a loophole that essentially when you look at Tesla, that's what they're trying to circumvent, sort of this kind of locational based, right, in terms of the source. But the technology is still Chinese, right? The cutout CATL batteries, they're not just made in China. They're now opening shops all over the world, right? You have in Hungary, you have in Thailand, you have in Mexico. So in a way, I think that is just playing this kinds of gray zone when it comes to the so-called cut China out of the supply chain. That's number one. Number two is we know that it's very likely potentially for these companies, GM or Tesla, they seem to likely to develop this kind of two-track system where, as we know, Tesla's Shanghai Gigafactory, it accounts for over 900,000 units, which is pretty much the number combined for its factories in the United States, right? One in Fremont, California, one in Austin, Texas. So those two factories combined produce about the same amount of cars as the Shanghai Gigafactory. And guess what? In Shanghai, they have 95% of localization rate. They have over 400 suppliers in China to supply their Shanghai Gigafactory, and 60 out of those 400, they actually supply to Tesla's global production. So again, my sense is that Tesla would want to work with these suppliers, especially in Shanghai, and for its American ones, they're not going to cut really China suppliers out, but they will, I don't know what would be the right word, plead or request, right? Some of these suppliers to open subsidiaries in Mexico or elsewhere, right? If they have already done so. So I think this is the way for them to go about the so-called cut China out of supply chain. Now, again, that is still a very costly proposition because China's supply chain is so complete, it's so integrated, it still has a tremendous amount of cost effectiveness. So even if a Chinese battery makers move to Mexico and Tesla is able to source from Mexico, that still adds to cost. And I think that is really the problem where, Tesla right now, the market share is declining. The US market share, when it comes to its global total sales, is about 35%. So in other words, if it were to develop this two-track system, then its US market share could still continue to decline because now things are going to be more expensive for Tesla, right, to serve that market. And so I think they may want to sort of have some kind of political support. They may want to kind of trying to do things differently a bit on the domestic market. But it doesn't change the fact is that, 65% of their sales are outside of the US market, and that relies very much on the Shanghai Gigafactory and also the Chinese supplies. So I think all these are caveats when you think about really the so-called diversification strategy, right? That it's trying to maneuver within the US market and made some gesture to cut the made in China components. But at the end of the day, I think it's really a lot more smoke than actual fire when you think about the shift.
Right. And Warwick, do you think it's like Yan just said, the only way for Tesla to do this is to maybe they can cut out all made in China, the physically made in China components. But for those made in factories invested in China overseas, they will just say it's not made in China, it's allowed. Is it the only way to do this? And how would this process happen?
Well, the more rules that get created in these sorts of systems, the more regulatory arbitrage is entered into by companies that seek to comply on the surface but reduce the costs of change.
Right.
And when it comes to these issues around the origins of supply chain components, the biggest issue revolves around the compliance on country of origin determination and labelling. Guarantee you that how country of origin will be defined will be a slippery proposition, and that will give room for companies like Tesla to notionally comply to the extent that they can, whilst at the same time fundamentally not changing too much. They simply can't afford to make the change, and certainly can't actually achieve the change quickly. It doesn't matter how much money you throw at some of these problems, the physical constraints, the upstream capabilities, the availability of enterprises with sufficient capacity plus financial capability to expand or augment their production to meet new customer requirements simply doesn't materialise quickly. And all of this smacks of politicking, and very little of this reflects fundamental operational requirements or enterprise economics.
Yes, like Yan just mentioned, if Tesla use components made in the U.S., it could raise Tesla's costs by a lot. But Yan, did you have any estimation that how much would Tesla cars cost, or how much would its cost rise if it cuts China-made components out of its production line?
Well, I think my basis of comparison is again the cars Tesla made in Shanghai, right, in the Gigafactory versus in the US. And
Right.
so I think the data that I have was back in 2024. An average price for those Tesla Models 3 is 33,000 in Shanghai, whereas in the US is 48,000. So anywhere between 30 or above differentials is the price differences, right? So even if, let's say, the production moves from China to Mexico, not exactly the same as expensive as in the United States domestic market, I think that still adds substantial amounts of cost. And I think, we also need to look at this in a more dynamic way because right now we know that the US is very slow in adopting EVs. When you look around other countries, China now is over 50% of its new car sales are in EVs, and Europe is also catching up really quickly. The US's, adoption of EVs in new car sales this year is probably going to be less than 10%. And now, and also in other countries, I think the price gap between EVs and their internal combustion cars, they're also quickly narrowing, right? China is already to the flip. The EV's average price is actually cheaper than the ICE prices. And Europe, they're also quickly shrinking, partly because, there are some Chinese plug-in hybrids that help to bring down the NEV prices. But the US is not seeing that. The US, you still see the NEV's price are much higher, right? 60K on average for EVs versus 46K for the traditional, internal combustion cars. So what I'm trying to say is that the price increase matters for consumers' adoption of EV. And so the less that the consumers are willing to adopt EV because of the price differentials, and we're talking about rising price differentials, right? And so that would further disincentivize the EV adoption by consumers. And so that inevitably is going to shrink even more the market share of EVs, or at least not, increasing in terms of the scale of production. So that would lead to even more costly, right, production down the road. So it's not a static problem that as if, one time there's a price adjustment. I think the kinds of cycle, right, the downward cycle, the more expensive, the fewer adoption, then even, more costly and so on and so forth, that could easily, materialize. So I think that is really a big problem when we think about the bigger scheme of things.
But on the other side, do you think the U.S. government or those policymakers would accept that it sourced from other places like Mexico or Vietnam from China-funded factories would, fit into the political demand from the government? Or would that make things worse?
Well, I think I agree with Warwick that this whole, countries of region kinds of regulations, it's very difficult to enforce. And because of the USMCA, right, this North American and Mexico's trade deal, they wanted to have the localization of their auto productions to 75% to be able to eligible to the tariff benefits. So I think Chinese car companies in Mexico, it's already a reality, right? I mean, 1 in 4 new cars sold in Mexico is Chinese car. So to what extent they can really enforce that country of regional rule, right? And also how much is sort of the localization rate you need to get for those second tier, third tier suppliers? I think that is really unclear, right? So that is definitely the gray zone. So in other words, if it's a Chinese company, but they're able to source 50% of their materials locally in Mexico, would that be sufficient, right? Or it has to be 75%. So I think there are all these complications. And also the key is here also that there's some core technologies, right? There's some core components that these car makers or battery makers in Mexico, they still have to import from China. So I think sometimes it's not in terms of the quantity, but really when it comes to what is the choke point and what is really indispensable, right? When it comes to Chinese technologies, its products and its services would come in. It's a much, much more complicated question than simply say, dollar-wise, I want this much dollar made in these 3 countries by the local firms that have, again, 75% of the components sourced locally. I think that is very difficult to position and very difficult to enforce. And it's not really helping any of these companies or the U.S. auto industries.
This has been the Chat Lounge. Up next, check out how the push for de-Sinicization may affect U.S. automakers' global edge. Don't go away.
Tales of Chinese Children is a collection of fairy tales and fables written by Edith Eaton, one of the first Asian American women writers from the turn of the 20th century. Edith focused on children who were treasured.
They are the sweetest gift of all.
lost,
Get away from me! Get away from me!
or misunderstood
My son, the evil spirit in your sister, had almost lost you to me.
in the complicated adult world, and much more. Search for Books and Beyond on radio.cgtn.com and all major podcast platforms to delve into an audio journey which allows the sound to linger around and above you for stunning realism.
Welcome back to the Chat Lounge. We continue our chat on Tesla's new auto gamble to drive without China. Tesla has asked its suppliers to diversify away from Chinese components long before this news was broken. Now it decided to push further this campaign or this plan, whatever you call it. Then, Joseph, what do you think the short-term and long-term impact would this have for Tesla in North America?
Well, I think it's going to affect stockholders. I mean, I couldn't, in good conscience, recommend Tesla tomorrow because of what's going on right now. I mean, I know they've been trying to diversify and they're trying to shore up their supply chains. But, you're at the end of the day, it's economic. It's not politics. Water seeks its own level, okay? Once they've talked about de-risking and decoupling and all the rest of it, these things that fit in your whatever you're building from across the world are going to go there. I want to just say to our guests, I attended an air show in Australia a couple of years ago, the Avalon Air Force Base, and they had all these F-35s they were showing, the Australians were showing off. And they had an exhibit next to the where the planes are flying, and it highlighted the contribution of 35 small to mid-sized Australian manufacturers who were able to design exclusively various components for the F-35. Kind of blew my mind that this F-35, which is sort of like a flag, an American flag all over the world, had 35 component parts coming from various parts of Australia that nobody had ever heard of. And the point is that economics trumps, no pun intended, trumps politics. So I think we're going to kind of get back to the economic decision. I think this idea of asking one of your suppliers to find some product that's not coming out of a Chinese factory. I mean, that's nuts. It's counterintuitive. I mean, it doesn't work. I mean, this whole idea of reducing dependency on Chinese suppliers is really an admission that decoupling doesn't work. So now they're talking about de-risking. They're not divorcing from the Chinese market. They're just trying to make it more stable for the Americans and be able to say that they're being more secure about it. So this is really kind of the fallback position. I think if Donald Trump, when he finally leaves office, I doubt the next administration is going to be as gung-ho as about these kinds of requirements. And, someone like Elon Musk, he made his billions of dollars by testing the wind when he got up in the morning. And I think these winds will blow in a very different direction after 2028.
Yeah, maybe he can gain some intimacy or closeness to the U.S. government. But here in China, how may Tesla's move affect its operations here then, Warwick?
Look, in terms of the gigafactory in Shanghai, I don't think it'll affect it very much at all. It's actually the jewel in Tesla's crown, and without it, it would be, as Yan mentioned, it wouldn't have the capacity to service the global market that it currently services in the way that it does. So I don't think it'll fundamentally change what's going on in the Shanghai Gigafactory in any real terms. Insofar as its Chinese supply chain partners are concerned for plants outside or assembly facilities outside of China, again, I repeat the point that I made earlier and the one that I think is echoed by the others, and that is that talk is cheap, but real action in supply chain reconfiguration is expensive and difficult. And come the midterm elections, which is 12 months away, the entire environment is likely to change. The political dynamics are likely to change. But given Tesla's problems with market share decline and diminishing relative competitiveness, it's totally understandable that its founder in particular is keen to find ways to expand the company's access to American government largesse and sinecures. It's really a way of plugging financial gaps that are emerging because Tesla's business model, which was premised on it being the unique standout EV manufacturer globally, has been undermined by the fact that the Chinese manufacturers caught up and overtook Tesla in terms of product quality and product price.
Right. Maybe its plan or the feasibility of the plan is not that high, but its talks or its narrative to move away from China-made components could upset the, Chinese government here, right? Tesla has long benefited from preferential policies in China. Could this push to de-Sinicize operations in the U.S. prompt Beijing to scale back those advantages or even introduce some hurdles for the company then, Warwick?
Look, I think Beijing's more mature than that.
All right.
It understands that there's a lot of politicking going on at the moment, but it has been very steady in its broad strategic approach to the global market, and that is that it seeks to be the adult in the room. It is increasingly opening up its market, continuing to raise the quality and standard of the openness of the Chinese economic system at large. It is enhancing the operating environment for companies, both local and foreign, and it is seeking to ensure that people understand that in a current environment globally marked by significant levels of uncertainty and fluidity, that China is a place that is sure, stable, reliable, and through that, a dependable place where entrepreneurs and financiers can make long-term capital commitments and develop solid businesses in the China market, both from a production point of view and also from a sales and distribution point of view as well. So I can't imagine Beijing acting with undue haste. It obviously is watching the circumstances closely. It is going to be calibrating its responses to the Trump administration's both tactical and strategic moves on the trade and investment fronts. But I doubt that there would be any hasty reactions to any of this.
Joseph, you agree?
I want to second Warwick's judgment there when he says that Beijing is more mature about this. And this goes in terms of foreign policy and economic policy. Beijing always plays the long game. They don't play the long game in Washington or in the Oval Office. They're thinking 6 months ahead, a year ahead, whatever it is. So China has this advantage of thinking about the long game. Americans have short-term advantage because it can do what it wants. I think America will kind of survive this. And the other thing too is the future of these cars, electrical cars in the United States. 340 million Americans, whatever. And we're going back to the internal combustion engine because America isn't really jumping up and down about electric cars. I mean, particularly outside of certain areas, the rural America is not jumping into electric cars because they haven't proven themselves. It's hard to service, and I don't even know what the resale value of a good electric car is. But I think that market's going to decline a little bit. And keep in mind that the American purchaser is not all cashed up. 70% of Americans live from paycheck to paycheck. About 2/5 of Americans are the working poor. They're working 2 jobs just to put food on the table. Americans don't have any savings because the rest of the world pours their savings in the United States. So, they don't have the savings and things. They're not going to go out and buy these expensive cars because they decided one day they're going to save the world, and they're not interested in that anymore under Trump. So, you got all kinds of things going on. And Musk has got a problem here. He's got to deal internationally. See, Musk plays the globalization game in a place like Washington or in the White House that doesn't think in terms of globalization anymore. They think they've disengaged from the global world. And it's not true at all. In fact, what they're doing now is it's about theater. And anytime you start to do anything for theatrical reasons in the marketplace, that is, whatever you're trying to persuade people you are, I think it creates uncertainty in the investor and in the international or in the banking community in America. And they're very reluctant to go all the way with this kind of thing because it looks like what it is. It looks like Plan B. It looks like it's some kind of a sop to Washington. You tell your suppliers to sort of source other sources of things. Where are they going to go? To the moon? I mean, Chinese with its vast industrial base, that is with its various scales of things, can do things that nobody else can do, and America can do things that nobody else can do. And of course, America and China should be complementary economies. They were for 20 years until someone decided that one day, these people are headed for war, which is ridiculous. Right. So, a lot of this is about politics.
That you are saying that the complete decoupling is unlikely to happen. But if the worst scenario happens, the entire U.S. auto industry follows this path, what are the broader consequences for both, China's auto industry and U.S. auto industry then? Yan?
Well, I think This question probably should be addressed in two different ways, right? One is, I think, in terms of complete decoupling. I think, again, the US has tried that, right? With all these tariff war and over 34% of tariff. It's meant to kind of create that scenario, but they very quickly walk back. So that's, Trump got his toggle name, right? They realized that they're so dependent on the Chinese supply chain. And so this whole decoupling, it's really impossible. And so that's why they revert back to the old playbook, right? The so-called de-risking. And that is mostly in the tech sectors. And again, in some of the other ones that they consider as very strategic, right? And somehow, again, depends on what they define as strategic. And that really could be going anywhere from garlic to extravagators or to EVs, right? To semiconductor chips. But nonetheless, I think the overall playbook right now is still this idea of de-risking. We see that in the semiconductor industry, in AI space, and it's likely that it's going to create a kind of two parallel system where the United States is, going for the moonshot. They are trying to, strive for the cutting edge, the core technologies in AI, for example, the generative AI, whereas China is open source and trying to integrate the AI technologies to the more broader economy and society. To really gain from productivity growth. So we kind of see the kind of two-track system that is forming in the AI space. And in terms of semiconductor chips, China is still slightly behind when it comes to these GPUs. And I think, NVIDIA still has another leg to go when their third quarter earnings actually beat the expectation, and that sent their stock value up by, again, 5%. But still, I think China is doing it in a very smart way. They're continuing to develop the high capacity, high-end AI chips. But on the other hand, they're engaging in this smart engineering where they can stack up the lower performing chips and still get the same kind of computational power. And so, again, we see the kinds of different tracks. And I think in the auto industry, I think, again, with the US's protectionism, as they try to deviate from China's technologies and try to reinvent the wheel, so to speak, right? Because they really are very slow in developing these LFP batteries. For a long time, they rely on the MCM battery, which are much more costly, and so on and so forth. And so I think it seems that the protected US market is very slow to adopt EVs and it's very slow in innovate for EV technologies. I mean, I have a Tesla that I bought a few years back that was quite at the beginning. And I also had a trial for the auto driving for a while. And I decided I didn't want to keep it because it was actually not that smart and not that intelligent. And so I mean, it's been years. We have not really seen major breakthroughs in any of these EV technologies. People still have the same range anxiety today than 4 years ago. I mean, in China, things have changed by leaps and bounds, right? That we're talking about 10 minutes charging that gives you, I don't know, 300 some thousand miles or whatever, right? And now you have also battery swap technologies. You don't even charge. You just, get rid of your own battery and you get new ones. And the cost is cheaper than a full tank of gas. And you got this fast charging and so on and so forth. I just think that maybe we're likely to see sort of a two-track system when it comes to automobile or generally mobility kind of developments, right? The US is sticking to the technology of the past, where China is forged ahead with futuristic technologies, right? We're not talking about self-driving cars. Now we're talking about, low altitude economies. We're talking about those VTOLs. We're talking about, all these other, I think, futuristic mobility potentials. So yeah, I mean, it is possible that we see this kind of two-track system developing. But again, I think that it's not really helping the United States in any ways. And without, technological innovations, they're also likely to lose foothold in the global market, right? The global footprint, as Tesla now is already the second top EV brands in the world. The market share has gone down. Now it's only 12%. And out of the top 10 BEVs, China has six top brands. Europe have two, US has one, and South Korea has one. So again, I think we could see temporarily this kind of two-track system, one within the United States, one outside of the United States, as long as that protection lasts. But again, I think one day, if the United States decide to look more outward, they will find the world is completely different.
Right.
I mean, I'm really sorry for a lot of US consumers, right? Myself included. We don't get these, high-tech cars. They're super intelligent and super environmental friendly and so on and so forth.
So you're saying that for Tesla itself, it's kind of like a self-sabotage, or it's the beginning of its decline, at least in the American market.
Absolutely. I think it's totally self-inflicted wound.
The Chat Lounge. The Chat Lounge unpacks views and opinions on hot issues in a more casual way.
And Warwick, your anticipation here.
What, in terms of Tesla's future?
Right, and the the whole picture for the global auto industry, maybe in the next 2 or 3 years?
Look, there are a number of, macro structural changes. One is, and Yan mentioned this earlier, and that is the price equalization point between EVs and ICE vehicles, which has taken place in China now. And that is accelerating the sale of EVs, and that will actually compound the relative price uncompetitiveness of ICEs as operational volume for its own supply chains progressively diminishes. So it will accelerate the fading away of ICE vehicles and accelerate the adoption of EVs in China. The European market, I think, is going to remain a problematic one in large part because the European political and regulatory environment remains uncertain. It has competing or contradictory ambitions in relation to environmentally related issues, but at the same time is seeking ways to protect incumbent manufacturers, particularly those that are still reliant on ICE technologies for their revenues. Globally, Latin America, Asia, parts of Africa will see significant growth in EVs, both in terms of importing EVs largely from Chinese factories, but also seeing the continued expansion of Chinese production facilities in these parts of the world. Combined with that, the rapid expansion of Chinese exports in renewable energy capabilities, building out the infrastructure and the systems that enable rapid electrification. We're going to see I think, an intensified shift towards electric vehicles in these other markets. The North American market really is going to be the odd one out, and there are going to be, as a result of that, I think, significant challenges for companies like Tesla, and it's already under financial stress. Its net margins are being squeezed. It is dependent on government arrangements to prop up its basic financials, but if it is to continue getting more expensive as it tries to make these supply chain changes, it will become less attractive as a business proposition. It's banked a lot on the future of self-drive, for example. Whether or not that comes to fruition will be an interesting thing to watch. But certainly I think Tesla's position as the out-and-out sector and product category leader 6 years ago is very much ancient history now. And part of the challenge in the automotive sector is that as these pressures compound, the ability for the enterprises to actually meet competition through available cash flow or credit becomes diminished. Chinese enterprises are actually turning out new models faster than Western autos are able to dream up new models. And that's always going to be a challenge for the incumbent ICE manufacturers who are trying to find their way into this new space. Tough times for ICE manufacturing, better times for EV manufacturing is the future.
Then what about for the general U.S. auto industry's competitiveness? Can it, they can just focus on North American market instead of the globe, and they can still have a competitive advantages there?
Well, it's competitive advantage.
I'm sorry.
Its competitive advantage is blocking everyone else, and it can have the market all to itself. That's what's happening.
Right. And Joseph?
I was going to say, I think Tesla will decline greatly in the United States. Let me tell you what Elon Musk missed not growing up in the United States, and that is America's love affair with internal combustion. The same way the American cowboys love their horses in the 18th and 19th century, Americans love their internal combustion and their machines. My dad used to take me to the Chicago Automobile Show in the 50s, and we got to see all the cars and all the cars of the future. Most of the cars of the future failed, of course, because Americans don't think that way. They sort of like cars that work and bigger, better, more chrome on them, etc. And Musk had a good idea initially, but he was always going to be kind of niche. America was never going to rush to these cars because he's never been able to beat that love affair with the internal combustion engine. And I think these moves are to sort of, maybe to increase the competitiveness of Tesla among other electrical vehicles. But in terms of the overall American market, I think he's going to have to settle for second fiddle because he never understood what America felt about its automobiles. And I do not see Elon Musk dominating the field in 10, 20 years. No one's going to talk about him in the way they talked about Henry Ford. I mean, it's just too great a legend and too much romance to overcome.
Right, but you've all touched a little bit on, Chinese suppliers or automakers. Yes, they may not suffer that much, but this decoupling or de-risking trend, if you will, is still happening, right? So Chinese always say prepare for the worst. So in the worst scenario, Yan, do you think Chinese suppliers, auto suppliers or automakers, they can weather this upcoming headwind? Or do you think they have this capability to eventually fare through this foreseeable difficulties, be it in the
Well,
short term or the long term?
right. Well, I mean, as far as the EV market is concerned, right? I mean, the US always, the biggest leverage is to say that they have the largest consumer market. But let's look at China doesn't sell many EVs to the United States, right? That's like only 1% of their EV exports. That's where the US is sort of as a market, right, for China's EV is. So in that regard, I don't think anything Tesla or other companies to a great extent would affect, China. And of course, there is a very large global sales market that is also adopting EVs, in a very rapid pace. As a matter of fact, I think the International Energy Agency just published a 2025 EV outlook, and pretty much it talks about how globally, right, we're seeing the prices EV has been going down, in Thailand, in Brazil, in all these markets, thanks to China's exports and Mexico as well. We're seeing that the EV price has gone down, and that make it a lot more affordable for consumers to adopt them. And I agree with Joseph. I think, the US has the traditional sort of culture of liking big, loud cars, right? Guzzler like SUVs and pickup trucks. But I think the rest of the world doesn't seem to have that problem. And I think actually, to be fair, I think the younger generation in the US, they are also much more environmental conscious. They're willing to accept, EVs. But again, that price differentials, right? The much more expensive, 30% higher price for an EV than a traditional car, that I think remains to be a big barrier. And the lack of innovations, lack of technological developments to ease the road range, the range anxiety, and also some of the sort of the performance in cold weather and extreme hot weather, things like that. I think that is still a barrier. But for the rest of the world, they're very quickly adopting EVs. When you just think about the tremendous growth, I think that we have seen, back in 2020, there's barely sort of any EV sales in the global market. Now, electric car the sales has exceeded 17 million globally in 2024. And so that's a market share of more than 20%. And again, with innovation that is really sort of fast paced, right? And I agree with Warwick, when you look at China, 18 months is what the Chinese EV makers need to develop a new car model or have a major redesign of the old model, right? 18 months. When you compare this with the traditional car makers, when they do a product upgrade, that takes like somewhere between 1.6 to 5 years. So we're really seeing this very fast product development, right? New design, new features, new functions, new technologies, and the prices, becoming more affordable. And climate change has been accelerating, which again push companies, governments and consumers, right, to accelerate that green transition. So I think that even without the US market, I think, with this growing market in global south in Europe, I think, Chinese EV industries is going to do well. I think now, one of the challenges, of course, is there's still a lot of market fragmentation. There are so many EV brands still in China now, compared to a couple of years ago, there are a lot more. Now it's already in some ways consolidated, but we're still talking about, 3 digits of different car brands. So it's possible that, cars going forward, they're going to compete more on technologies, on the features, on the new designs rather than on prices, right? Which could help to stabilize, these car prices and also profitability of some of these car makers. But again, I think in China, this auto industries or the EV industries, the predominant, I think, incentive is still trying to make things affordable, trying to have larger adoptions, market share of these products, rather than, keep the products limited quantity so that you can raise higher prices and so on and so forth, right? For profit driven, right, incentives. So I think, Chinese car makers, they have the competitiveness, they have the right incentives, they have the really innovability edge. And I think without the US market, they will be just doing fine. And I think, again, this is ultimately, I think, it's the US's loss, right? It's the consumer's loss that they're not able to have these really environmental friendly and intelligent cars. And just one thing about, I think Elon Musk, I agree with Joseph. I think, he actually does a lot of damages to its own EV, right? There are many people around me that have the stickers, right? That I bought this Tesla before Elon gets crazy. That still, right, stays in many people's cars. Not to mention, I think this whole idea of him getting a $1 trillion package and control 25% of the stake of Tesla, right? Even though, yes, there are some conditions that he probably won't be able to meet. But still, I think just that notion of having a trillionaire who is supposed to be a tech entrepreneur, right? And sort of search for the next level of technologies and good product. And yet, we're talking about $1 trillion of package for him. I think that is a big turnoff for many of consumers, I think, in the US.
Okay. At Warwick, do you have a different opinion here?
Well, look, I'll summarize it like this.
All right.
The rest of the world market is going to grow at a rate that will require an expansion of productive capacity for EVs. That expansion is going to come from China, both in terms of facilities in China itself and also an increasing growth in Chinese factories, whether they're joint ventures or fully owned, that are being developed elsewhere in the world to meet those growing markets. What Tesla does is really going to be a matter for Tesla. The US market hasn't been important for Chinese manufacturers forever and a day, basically. Insofar as the supply chain is concerned, if Tesla does successfully wean itself off Chinese upstream component suppliers, which I don't think it can, but if it does, the expanded demand requirements as a result of growth in the rest of the market, including China's own market, will more than readily compensate for that. China will simply adapt and its supply chain will move on. American consumers can continue enjoying their noisy, smelly cars.
All right. And last question for Joseph. Some people are saying that if geopolitical tensions cool, Tesla and other U.S. automakers may come back to China's supply chain. So, since you're a professor of global futures, when do you think this geopolitical tensions may cool, or is it possible?
I think we're going to be okay. In Washington, they spend about about $70 billion a year on intelligence and across 18 agencies, and they've all come up with the idea that, or the conclusion that China is the number one competitor in the world today, and Russia's the second one. So much for all the money spent on it, as a matter of fact. And the notion is that China will translate its economic strength into military strength and challenge the United States everywhere. Well, that's not going to happen. There is not a single issue in Sino-American relations worth one minute of thermonuclear war, okay? There's going to be no war over Taiwan, despite all the noise that comes out of Washington and among the elites, certainly not in the body politic of America. And there might be conflict in other places, but this idea that China and America are at loggerheads and it will stop everything else. I mean, the only thing that's going to screw up the Chinese economy is war with the United States, and it's not going to happen so long as cooler heads prevail. And of course, at the end of the day, these people who are beating the war drums they talk about China as a potential adversary, when in fact China is an economic competitor. And on that level, I think the United States and China will go on. I think they will avoid conflict because of the economic connections, not in spite of the economic connections. That's why I hate to see foreign economic policy dragged down into nationalistic jingo and the rest of it, because it is counterproductive. But I think these two economies will continue to grow. I think we will re-engage with globalization in the years ahead as soon as we're past the Trump experiment. And as soon as people start to realize that there were parts of globalization that made a great deal of sense. The problem in the 80s was someone forgot to explain to the American people what globalization was. So when they lost their jobs to Venezuela or some other Mexico or someplace, they started to give it a very negative connotation. And when they identified it with American elite foreign policy politics, they lost the point of the business. So we're going to have to go back to the definition. But globalization is here to stay. It will continue to underwrite Sino-American relations. And I think the economy, the Sino-American economic connection, will grow and grow over the years until such time that they don't really need each other. I mean, they do. They're completely interchanged right now, and they're interoperational as I talk to you on my Chinese computer. But there's just no way we're going back on this unless someone decides to go to war one day. That's not going to happen in a rational world.
All right, on that note, we wrap up our chat for this session. Many thanks to Joseph Siracusa, Professor of Global Futures, Curtin University, Warwick Powell, Adjunct Professor, Queensland University of Technology, and Liang, Professor of Economics, Willamette University. Thank you for joining us and tuning in. We'd love to know what you think. Drop us a line anytime at radio@cgtn.com. I'm Tu-Yin. Join us for more chat at the Chat Lounge next week. Talk to you soon.
The strong wind was howling and whistling.
He was the first Chinese citizen to graduate from Yale University in the mid-19th century.
I was born on the 17th of November. She had prominent features. 3 of us were old enough to lend a helping hand.
He navigated between 2 vastly different cultures and moved further to realize his dream and promote understanding between the people of China and the United States.
Ye Mingxing was a native of Hanyang. I realized no danger. China is really awakening.
Come and join us in discovering the incredible journey of Yong Wang in his autobiography, My Life in China and America. Check out the Audible stories on radio.cgtn.com and all major podcast platforms. Just search for the podcast Books and Beyond and find My Life in China and America.